Hi guys. Today we are going to begin our unit on global contemporary. This is the last section for AP Art, and it's called Global Contemporary because it's 1980 to present, but it's 1980 to present all over the world. So we have pieces from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, Native Americans. So we have a huge group of works, but they're all since 1980s. They're all in our contemporary time period. And it could, because remember, I have to keep reminding you of this. Modern is a time period. It doesn't mean, oh, look, that's so modern, meaning now. Modern is a time period from the 20s to the late 60s. And then we hit postmodern, and then we're in contemporary. So that's where we are now. And our very first work is a work called The Gates. And The Gates was in New York City. And you'll see what's interesting about The Gates there is as 1979 to 2005. And the reason for that is Christo and his wife Jean-Claude started plans to construct the gates in 1979. And it took from 1979 until February 12th of 2005 for them to get done all of the things that they needed to get done in order to construct this piece. And so what you're looking at is, if you know anything about New York City, what you're looking at is Central Park. And if you know your New York City stuff, you'll know that Central Park doesn't have all this orange stuff. What the heck is all that orange stuff? Well, that orange stuff is a mixed media installation. So this is your first image. It's an aerial photograph of Central Park. And this is your second image. This is one of the walkways in Central Park. And the gates are these structures. There are, as you see, more than 7,500 of these gates. It stretches around Central Park. And so the path that the gates take is 23 miles long. They are 16 feet high. And the $21 million cost was completely funded by Jean-Claude and Christo. Christo is a Bulgarian artist. Jean-Claude, his wife, French descent, born in Morocco, raised in France. And so you're looking at basically a panel. Okay, so you see you have three sides. You have the left side, the top, and the right side. And they sit on these two, so what you're looking at are steel poles. Steel footings and vinyl poles. And you'll see that these vinyl poles sit on top of these steel footings. And then the fabric, it's the color that they say that it is saffron, like the spice. The fabric hangs from the top of this sort of U-shaped vinyl thing. And so what you're looking at is that the fabric and the gate are the same color. You're looking at them sitting on top of these steel footings. And what is really important about this is that the installation is on the path that runs through Central Park, but at no point does it really impede traffic, because the gates are 16 feet high, and the fabric only hangs down like halfway. You have some clearance there. So there's an 8-foot clearance from the bottom of the fabric down to the path. And so you can see, here's one gate and here's the path here. And you can see that these steel footings sit on the edge of the path through Central Park. So it allowed people to walk through. It meant that they didn't have to dig into the soil or put anything in the soil. It meant that that way that nothing had to interact or harm the root systems for any of the trees. It also meant that all of the materials, because of the way that they were created, it is all of the materials are able to be recycled. The fabric was able to be recycled, the vinyl was able to be recycled, the steel footers were able to be recycled. And so, what's really important is that Jean-Claude and Christo really thought about how this installation, temporary installation, would impact the people that walk through it, but also how it would impact the environment both during and after. So it called the gates. Well, let's talk about it. It creates an oval around Central Park. So let's go back to our first image. And so we see that the gates wander here through Central Park. And they create this, this walking path. And so what's interesting about them is because they're sort of an oval shape, there's not really a place that is technically the beginning or the end of the installation. It's also opened, the gates are open, but it's also closed. It's sort of a study in things that are opposites of each other, things that are juxtaposed with each other. And what do I mean open and closed? Well, you can walk the whole loop, right? But the loop itself is closed off from the rest of the park. So it's just sort of this open and closed things. They also want you to think about the impact that this installation has on the park and on the people that look at it. Central Park was originally created in the 19th century to give people in New York City and Manhattan, a green space to go, and which is why you have this huge open green space in the middle of the city. And so, it's this really cool concept of there being this entrance and exit out of the park. It's a really great concept of things being both an open circuit and closed at the same time. It feels very permanent. It's able to stay up from February 12th to February 27th, so a little over 2 weeks. In February, February is cold in Manhattan. It's cold, it's snowy, it's breezy, and it's this concept that this was able to sit out in the weather. But it's also very cool in that while it is a temporary exhibit, it feels very permanent. But it's also interesting in that the exhibit itself, because it is temporary, creates a certain amount of urgency, a certain amount of excitement. You really wanted to be in Manhattan during these 2 weeks so that you could walk through Christo's gates. It took them, as I said, about a little over 20 years to even get to the point where Manhattan and the government would contemplate letting them do this. Then September 11th happened and things got pushed back even further because entrance and exit out of the city and was impacted by the things going on at Ground Zero, and they were really concerned about bringing a lot of stuff into the city and things like that. What are the two major things that Jean-Claude and Christo wanted you to think about? They wanted you to think about, one, how do you create what is meaningful public art? And two, they wanted you to think about how art responds to and impacts your environment. How does art respond to your environment? What goes on around you? And how does art impact what goes on around you? Jean-Claude and Christo are very famous for doing these site installations. Here's a really beautiful shot of them constructing the gates, people running through them. As I said, it was snowy and windy, so here's a really great set of a picture of the gates sitting on top of one of the bridges in Central Park. Jean-Claude and Christo are very famous for doing site installations. I'm not sure if you've ever seen this, but this is Biscayne Bay. They wrapped the small islands in Biscayne Bay with this beautiful pink satin. But this is Christo, this is his wife Jean-Claude, and they completely funded this, and which is really cool because the city's like, sure, as long as you're willing to completely fund it, go right ahead. And they were like, sure, we'll totally fund it. Because they could then sell rights to photographs and the book and blah, blah, blah. And so it worked out for everyone, that it brought tourists into the city, and it didn't do any damage to the park. And Jean-Claude and Christo were able to do their installation and make some money as well. She died a few years ago. I believe he's still alive. The second one for today is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And so this was constructed in 1982. It is right downtown in DC. Many of you may have been there. If you've never been there, when we're all out of quarantine, you should make a plan to go down and see it. And so what you're looking at is a very minimalist. Okay, so we're back to minimalism. Like Villa Savoy is minimalist. We're at a minimalist concept of a memorial. And when you think memorial, especially if you're from around this area, you think Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, you think these big buildings with big statues of people in the center. This is very much not that. So this was constructed in 1982. It sits on just 2 acres. The plot of land that it sits on is only 2 acres. It's not very large at all. And it's sort of nestled on the National Mall in Congressional Gardens, and it sits between the Washington Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial. And one of each of the arms of the of this Veterans Memorial points. One points to the Washington Memorial, one points to the Lincoln Memorial. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful memorial. But it was highly, highly controversial at the time in which it was created, because in 1982, the Vietnam War was still very controversial. And so you have to have a little bit of your background to Vietnam. You have to know that Vietnam, we instituted the draft. A lot of people went over to fight in a war they didn't agree with and they didn't believe in, and they were forced to go in because they were not, they didn't volunteer, they didn't, register or enroll, they didn't, it wasn't a volunteer army, it was a drafted army. And so what you're looking at is a memorial that contains the names of over 58,000 United States soldiers who were killed fighting in Vietnam. The problem is that the Vietnam War was the first war to be really televised. It was very divisive because many people did not agree with the United States being involved in Vietnam. And a lot of really terrible things happened there. And when soldiers came home, they were treated horribly. And there are a lot of Vietnam soldiers who to this day won't speak about the time that they were in the Army, because it was so difficult for them, not only when they were there, but also when they came home. One of the few good things to come out of the Vietnam War is that as a nation, we figured out that we could be against the war, but not against our soldiers, which was something that this country definitely saw manifested when the war in Afghanistan and Iraq started. There were a lot of people that were against those wars as well, but not necessarily against our soldiers. And so Vietnam caused for America a very steep learning curve. We were still very much in that learning curve in 1982 when the money had been raised to create a memorial. They did a contest they did a contest of who would go to design it. There were more than 1,400 entries. And the important thing about the entries is all the entries had to be to be entered anonymously. They couldn't have a name attached to them. So they were identified by numbers only. And this meant that anyone who had design experience, who wanted to put together a design plan, could do so. And so there were more than 1,400 entries. And so think about, the Palace at Westminster when they put out a call for for entries for design plans for the new Palace of Westminster. So what happened was the the woman who won was a graduate student at Yale School of Architecture. And if you see her name, Maya Lin, she is a Chinese American. And when it was revealed that Maya Lin had won, the backlash was awful. People were so horrible to her, to the design. This idea that we would have um, and the word then was that was often used was Oriental, that we would have an Oriental person designing this monument for our men who were killed in Asia. It was really a continued to be very divisive. But she was selected, and they used her design, and it is a beautifully wonderful, powerful design. And so if you've never been to it, I'm going to do the aerial first. When you look at it, you're looking at, as I said, the two arms. It meets in the center here, and it is this sort of V-shaped memorial, and it is a wall. It's often called the Vietnam Wall or the Memorial Wall, and it is a wall of highly reflective black granite. And the names of the people who were killed in the Vietnam War are carved into the wall. It at its highest point in the center here, it is 10 feet tall. And at its lowest point, when you go back and look at it, I mean, it comes all the way down to the end of the ground here. So it goes up to 10 feet and back down. It is meant to look like, so let's go back to our aerial shot here. It's meant to look kind of like a scar on the land. And because that is what the Vietnam War was, it was a scar on our land. It was a very difficult time for our country. And so each of these men is given their chance to be remembered for the sacrifice that they gave. The names are in chronological order. So you start here, and the names are in chronological order of those who are dead or reported missing in action and never found. So the important thing here is that it doesn't just do those that were killed in action. It also does missing in action, never found. Those men who went over and never came home, but there was no body to bury. Those men's names go here too, and they're marked with this particular symbol to identify whether or not the person is dead or missing in action. And there's actually been corrections to the wall when remains have been returned to the United States. They will change the marking from being a missing in action marking to being a killed in action marking to signify that those remains had been returned. It is kind of like a path, kind of like a journey. You start here at the beginning of the war, you go down deep into this crevice, and you come back out. Maya Lin said that it was meant to be like you were walking a path that was the initial violence and pain of the war, followed by coming out of that violence and pain and into sort of a healing. Um, I believe that it is a really beautiful, powerful memorial. Maya Lin said that the names are etched into this mirror-like granite because she wanted the contrast between the names and the background, and she wanted the names to feel like they had more weight, that the names were real and substantive. And because the granite is sort of so polished and reflective, it has this sort of otherworldly not quite tangible feeling to it. And you can see that here. It's highly reflective, so that as you walk past, you see the names, but you also see yourself. Um, it's a wonderful tribute to these men. And what is interesting is that it's actually become um, um, like a pilgrimage place. Many men who fought in the Vietnam War have come to this wall and left things behind for comrades, friends, people that were in their platoons and things like that. And you can sort of see a sample of that here. People leave all kinds of things. There's actually a museum that collects all of the things that have been left at the wall for display. Things as simple as just flowers, all the way up to a Harley Davidson motorcycle, I know, was left at the wall at one point. And it's very much meant to be cathartic. It's a way for people to process the pain and the journey and the the way that the war impacted our country. Um, what is very interesting is that uh, this really is a very contemporary way to memorialize people. It is both powerfully meaningful and abstract at the same time. It is both uh, personal and holistic. It's really quite lovely. Um, Two closing thoughts about the Vietnam Memorial. Most of the granite, black granite, that would be used for construction like this would usually come from either Sweden or Canada. Those are where the most common places to get this granite were from. But in in a way of honoring um, the dead, um, they refused to use granite that came from either Sweden or Canada because those were two places that draft dodgers went during the Vietnam War. Many went to Canada, and many went to the Scandinavian countries to escape the draft. And they just didn't believe that it would be appropriate to use granite from there to construct this. Believe the granite that they ended up getting came from Turkey. Um, it, so many things were contemplated when creating this, and because people were so uncomfortable with how new and how different it was, and what it looked like is you have this this memorial, and people wanted something that felt more realistic. And so in these trees here are some sculptures of some 3D soldiers, 3D sculptures of soldiers with their backpacks on, and they appear to be, moving through the forest, the jungle here. And those sculptures were added after this was created in order to sort of placate people and make them a little happier about the fact that this, they didn't feel like this was natural enough, personal enough. And the further we get away from the construction of this memorial, the more people come to embrace how perfect a memorial it actually is. And that's one of the great things about contemporary art is people like me live through many of these things, and we can look back and say, wow, that was not how people responded at the time, but as we've progressed through, it really has become a very an important piece of American history. So that is Global Contemporary 1. 8 more to follow. All right.